Our preacher today is none other than the pastor of Grace Point Church in Biddeford. He's also one of our board members. His name is Andrew Ward. And Andrew Ward is so excited to come out here because he actually gets to share the good news instead of any not so good news. And he's going to redeem the good news about the gospel today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Andrew, good to see you.
Hey, good morning. Man, I got to first say how much I appreciated and enjoyed worshiping Jesus with you. Give it up for the worship team. It's just awesome. And you know, as good as they are, without the tech team in the back wrestling tech demons all the time, I mean, man, they were so patient with me. You know, if you're looking for a place to get involved and you're good at wrestling tech demons or leading in worship, definitely talk to someone on the worship team, talk to someone back there. They would love to talk to you about it. And they were so patient with me this morning. It was unbelievable. So if you're like, I'm not sure, I don't want to be in like a really rigorous, they'll walk you through. If they can handle me, they can handle you, okay? So it's going to be great. I want to jump into the book of Mark. I think that you guys were in a series through Mark, and that maybe like started last fall and kind of ended in November, Christmas, 21 days of prayer and fasting. Mark kind of reminds me of a TV show, the Gospel of Mark. When my oldest was born, she had hip dysplasia, and at the time, it meant she wore like a harness for a couple of months. And she couldn't sleep on her back as a result of that, and she couldn't sleep on her stomach, so she slept on either my wife or I for the first couple months of her life. And as new parents, you are paranoid. Like, you're just terrified of like something. So we slept in a couch, and we were like, we didn't even like want to fall asleep because we were concerned that like if we slept, something would happen, because it's not normal that you have your kids sleeping on you that long. So we found this TV show at the time was pretty popular. This is about 14 years ago, called 24. Any of you remember 24 a little bit? Couple hands? Okay, yeah, 24, yeah. It's basically this one guy who has the whole weight of the world on his shoulders, and every 24 hours the world is trying to blow up, and he's got to stop this, and this count, like this clock that ticks down all the time. I mean, he's high intensity, high movement, and it's kind of just an adrenaline show. The book of Mark reminds me of that because it's a lot of action. This is one of 4 gospel accounts. 3 of them are eyewitness accounts that we have of Jesus and his ministry. It's written by people who saw the ministry of Jesus. Mark is a little different. It's the shortest, but B, it's also very, very high on intensity, action, and movement. It doesn't include some of the teachings of Jesus in the same way or same degree that other Gospels do. But I love the book of Mark. The book of Mark is almost kind of like you say, don't tell me about it, just show me. And this is the Gospel of Mark. The scholars say it's like from Peter, the Apostle Peter, you know, like the foot in the mouth apostle. You know, it was his gospel recorded by John Mark. So that's where we get the Gospel of Mark. And we are going to pick up this morning in Mark chapter 6, and we're going to start in verse 36. Mark chapter 6, verse 36. This is picking up after an intensive time of ministry. Jesus has sent his apostles out. They are doing healing. They are doing teaching. They are casting out demons just like they saw Jesus do. And now they're coming back and gathering again together, kind of for like a team huddle is what you guys would call it, right? They're having this team huddle, debriefing what's gone on. And so we see in verse 36, it says, the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. So there's this debrief time. They're kind of coming back to Jesus saying, hey, here's how it went. And we know sometimes with the disciples, sometimes with us, it goes great, and other times it needs some improvement. All of this is happening here in verse 30. And 31, Jesus said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while. I love that Jesus, in the midst of ministry, in this amazing task of only having 3 years of active ministry, he understands that his disciples are human. And he says, come apart and rest. There are periods of work, and there's periods of intensity, and there's periods of effort, and then there's also periods of rest. And Jesus invites and encourages them into this period of rest. Why did he do this? Why? Because it says that for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. Now, you can relate to a little bit of this. You just went through 21 days of prayer and fasting. And different than setting aside food deliberately for a period of prayer, it said they were so busy that they didn't have the leisure to eat. Now, I don't think of eating as leisure. Like, I think of it as pleasure. I think of it as like a task to be accomplished. It's something that's pretty important in my schedule. And yet they said ministry, which is so crazy that they didn't even have time to eat. It says, so they went away in a boat to a desolate place by themselves. They went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now, they were in northern Israel at the time. They're on the Sea of Galilee. And so while they're there, they are going to say, we're going to sail from one side of the Sea of Galilee to the other side and get away from all the crowds that have been following them and chasing them, looking to be ministered to them. And so they take this boat. Many of the disciples were fishermen, so they're going to hop on a boat and get away from there. The problem is, many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. Can you imagine how discouraging this would have been for the disciples? You're like you're going to go on. Jesus said it's vacation time. It's time to get rest. And then as you're going, this is not speedboats, power boats. Some of you guys have bass boats or ocean boats. This is slow. They're sailing or rowing from one side to the other. You can see this whole crowd chasing you around the sea, or more likely a lake of Galilee. And by the time you get to where you're going, the desolate place, there's going to be a whole crowd there. The first thing we see in this passage is that there's interrupted plans. They had a plan for rest, and it was interrupted. Last year I had to make a work trip, and I decided to take the motorcycle, and it was about 700 miles around the state of Maine. I had a bunch of stops. I had to do it in about 24 hours. Got rained on 5 or 6 times, just absolutely poured. Did you know Caribou is still in Maine? That's really far up there. So anyway, I was coming back, and I was like, I just need a nap. I had a meeting at 2 o'clock, I believe it was. I got in at 1:30, and so I'm geared up head to toe in motorcycle gear, and I was like, I'm just going to take a nap. So I was in Gorham. There's a parking lot, and they have those little islands in the parking lot like you kind of have here. Nice shady tree. Beautiful day now. The rain has stopped. So I just sprawled out under this tree. My bike is parked next to me. I'm like, I got 15 minutes to take a nap. And I have the spiritual gift of sleep, okay? I fall asleep quick. Some of you get that. My wife is the opposite. She's the spiritual gift of not sleep. Me, I just fall asleep quick. I'm out. And then, it's sort of in the fog and the haze of sleeping, I hear somebody yell at me. And I'm like, and all of a sudden you're kind of coming to, they're like, hey, hey. And I opened my eyes a little bit, and I was like, there's this older gentleman there. And I was like, hi, can I help you? He's like, is that your bike? And it's 3 feet from me. I'm dressed in motorcycle gear, right? I'm like, yes. And I'm thinking, is it on fire? Is someone stealing it? And he's like, no. He's like, oh, that's cool. I used to have a bike. It created a lot of unspiritual thoughts at that particular moment. I'm like, I was resting, I was exhausted, I had worked hard, and you interrupted me for seemingly the most obvious question of all time. And sometimes in our life, in our journey, there are interruptions. I don't even need to ask if you've ever had any plans that were interrupted. Because you're human, you're here, you're breathing. You've had interrupted plans. The disciples had a promised, well-deserved rest, and yet their plans were interrupted by this crowd that so wanted to see Jesus, so wanted to experience Jesus, that they are chasing them around the Sea of Galilee, and by the time they arrive, they're there waiting for them. We see the response in the next verse when he went ashore, and I think it's interesting, it just says he, it's Jesus. I don't know if the rest of the disciples are kind of hiding below the boat, hoping nobody will see him, but it says he went ashore, and he saw the great crowd, and he had compassion on them. Why? It says, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. I think this is so fascinating. My response to this gentleman waking me up and interrupting my beautiful nap is one of anger. And Jesus sees this interruption, and he responds with compassion. He sees them, and he says, yeah, this wasn't the plan. This was the vacation we were going to go on. And yet he sees people. Sometimes it's easy for us to see tasks. We see people in front of us in their cars and they're not turning right on red. And that's really angering. Or they're checking out in a line behind them and they still, some reason, are trying to use exact change. Like, that's frustrating. Or there's certain agendas that we have and people at work are not getting their stuff back to them and we get frustrated. And yet Jesus sees the same people and doesn't see an interruption. He sees them with compassion. He sees them and he loves them. And what was he taking a break from? Teaching. What's he start doing here? It says he begins to teach them. Jesus sees people. But it doesn't end there. It says when it grew late, his disciples came to him. They kind of picture them eventually crawling out of the boat. And he says, they came to Jesus and this is a desolate place. And the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and the villages and buy themselves something to eat. Now this is pretty practical, right? You got all these people here. They've been walking all around the Sea of Galilee. They kind of meet up with Jesus and the disciples. Jesus seemingly teaches them all day, and now it's dinner time. And the disciples are like, let's put a pause on this. Send them away. Tell them to come back next Sunday. That's my translation on that. Jesus, it's interesting, like, they see this as a problem. Like, they see this as a problem to be solved. There's a problem. There's people here. They're hungry. Some of them are even going to get hangry. That's a difference. Like, some people get hungry. Some people get hangry. We got some family members like that. He's like, we got to send these away because they need something to eat. Jesus sees the people. The disciples, they see the problem. They don't look at these people as like people that need the love of Jesus, need the teaching of Jesus, need the healing of Jesus. They're like, we did that on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. This side is supposed to be rest, and now they're hungry. Let's send them away. Let them get something for themselves to eat. Jesus answered them, and I love this. Jesus kind of flips the script. He answered the disciples, and he says, you give them something to eat. Now, in some ways, we should praise the disciples. Like, they're proactive, right? They're seeing a problem. They're anticipating a problem. They're dealing with a problem. And they come to Jesus. They're like, hey, all you got to do is make an announcement. It's solved. And Jesus says, no. He says, you feed them. You give them something to eat. Jesus, makes it their responsibility. And they respond to him. They said, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? This is about somewhere between maybe $20,000 to $30,000 worth of food. They come to Jesus, they're like, hey, we got a problem. Jesus says, you feed them. Can you imagine even just this room, if you're responsible, said, hey, you're going to feed everybody today. You're like, oh no, that's not great. That's expensive. And that's what they're thinking is that they're like, there's a huge crowd here. We can't feed all these people. What's interesting is that Jesus pushes the disciples into the problem. He's not actually he could just feed everybody, right? Jesus doesn't need the disciples. They're not crazy helpful on this feeding side of things. We don't know that any of them were chefs. Jesus could just do this. His first miracle was turning water into wine. He's got a whole lake right next to him. He could easily make all the fish jump out of the lake. He could easily handle all the drinks. This is not a problem for Jesus. Jesus isn't over his head. He's not oh, yeah, people are getting upset. What do we do? No, he puts the problem on them. He pushes them into the problem. Which should lead us to think well, why does Jesus do that? Jesus had it all handled. He didn't need them. So why did he push them into this problem? We're going to see the answer to that in just a little bit. Jesus said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. So now he gives them homework. He's like, hey, I want you to go do some research, figure out who's got food in this whole crowd. We're told from other stories, it says they had found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. Another gospel tells us that one boy brought a lunch. One kid prepared, and we know it wasn't the kid, right? It was the mom. The mom was like, son, pack your tunic and your lunch. You're going to be hungry. And the mom's like, Mom. And then this is the only guy that shows up with food. Like one person, massive crowd, 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, I don't care how big those loaves were, and I don't care how big those fish were. You've got a monstrous crowd, which we're going to see later is like thousands of people. And you got scraps, essentially, of bread. And yet, Jesus commands them to sit down on the grass by hundreds and by 50s. Why? I think that's actually, A, for organization, so you can distribute the food. Like they're already, all they have is 5 loaves, 2 fish, and they're already saying, let's plan on how to organize and distribute this. Also, I think it helps later with counting how many are there. But he says, sit down on the grass. It's interesting if you notice that verse, the green grass, and allow me just to be a nerd for just a second here. Some of you might read this and think like, how can I trust this account? Like sometimes people say, oh, the Bible is written like hundreds of years after this story. Well, this story takes place in Israel. You know what there's not a lot of? Green grass. Like there's a lot of burnt grass, but interestingly, there's only one time a year there's green grass. And if you look at the other passages, you put all those together, this is exactly the time that the author's saying. There's one time a year there's green grass, and this is exactly it. It's almost like it was written by an eyewitness. Kind of cool, huh? Anyway, nerd moment over. And so they sat down by groups, hundreds and 50s. It says, and taking the loaves, the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, Jesus looked up to heaven, and he said a blessing, and he broke the loaves, and he gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them. I would have loved to know how this looked, right? Is Jesus like literally personally like breaking off like each person going around enough there? Or is he kind of like breaking off chunks into like baskets, and then each disciple goes, and then they just keep taking out of the basket, but the basket doesn't run out? We're not really told exactly how this looks. But Jesus takes the 5 loaves, the 2 fish, and he breaks them. And he gives thanks to God for that. This is the blessing. And then he distributes that among the entire crowd. Remember the question we asked earlier? We said, did Jesus push the disciples into the problem? Why? I believe so that they could experience the miracle. Like Jesus didn't need the disciples. They weren't masters at fish reproduction or photocopying bread. He wanted them to experience something that they didn't see. There's actually a couple of crowds that we should think of. First, the crowd that we don't think about at all here is there's a crowd that heard Jesus or maybe even didn't show up for Jesus on the other side of the lake. What did they get to see or experience here? Nothing. They weren't there. Like they were absent. Maybe they were interested in Jesus at a casual level, but regardless, they stayed where they were on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Then you've got like sort of like your all-star interest people. Like they're committed enough to like Jesus is going around the lake. We're going to walk around the entire lake to go see Jesus. And we want to hear him teach. We want to hear him speak. But what are they doing while this is all going on? Well, they're sitting on the grass. Now, it's a fine place to be, but they're sitting on the grass. The disciples were the ones that Jesus pushed into this and said, no, you're solving this problem. You be a part of the solution. What did they come back with? They came back with 5 sticks of bread and 2 fish. That's not enough. But they, as a result of this, got to see something. What did they get to see? In verse 42, it says, they all ate and were satisfied. Now, we got some teenage boys in this room here, you know. There's some people who have some appetites. And this isn't just eat, like everybody's like, here's a little square for you. Like, okay, doesn't that fill you up? Okay, here's a little square for you. Okay, that's good. That's all we have. No, they ate and they were satisfied. Like, this is like going to the buffet and you eat till you're sick and then you're like, the dessert bar still looks good. We're still good. I mean, we have a little room left. Like, they ate till they couldn't eat anymore. How do we know that? The next verse says, and they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and fish. Like, they had so much that everybody gets to eat. Everybody eats till they're stuffed, and then they have, like, my favorite thing, leftovers. Some of you are fans of leftovers. Like my wife, like if it's 30 seconds, it's not any good to eat. For me, cut the mold off, and you're still good to go. I mean, especially if it's like strawberry rhubarb pie. You cannot let that go to waste. Just trim the bowl, keep eating. They had leftovers. Everybody was so full they could not eat anymore. All from 5,000 or 5 loaves and 2 fish. And it said the number of those who ate were 5,000 men. How many people exactly were there? We don't know. At least 5,000. Like, did they all bring a spouse? You got 10,000. Did they bring your kids? 80,000. I don't know. There was a lot of people there. There was at least 5,000 people there, and they all ate till they were full. And I think this confronts how we often view life. We see problems, Jesus sees people. We see obstacles, Jesus sees opportunities. We see difficulties, and Jesus is like, this is awesome. You're not going to believe this. It's going to be an amazing divine moment. The reality is that what you see as a massive problem is God inviting you into a miracle. Like, if you're here on this day, everybody got to eat, but the disciples got to be a part of that. Like, they were handing it out. Can you imagine being like James or John going around with this basket, and you're just like, it just keeps coming. Everybody there's full. Everybody got to hear the teaching of Jesus. But the disciples, they got to experience a miracle. Because they said yes to God, because God brought them into the problem, and they didn't run from it, they got to experience God doing something amazing. Like, it's easy for us to look at the problems of life, and we look at the difficulty, we look at the resources that we have, and we're like, that ain't going to add up. Or we look at the task, or God's put something on our heart and mind, and we're like, yeah, I just don't have all the wisdom it takes. I think of the amazing Rock Kids team. I was there, with them earlier doing a huddle. Oh, it's so cool. I mean, sometimes we're like, I talk to people like, I don't want to teach kids. What if they ask me a question that I don't know the answer to? I'll let that be for somebody else. And yet you feel God working in your heart to do that, and you're like, I'll be praying for somebody else to step up into that. But what if we're looking at it wrong? What if what God is calling us to isn't, so it's a responsibility, it's a privilege. Like, as we say yes to God, as we step into things that don't make sense, that we get to see and experience God doing amazing things. And the reality is, it's still God. None of the disciples were like great at multiplying fish. They could barely catch fish in some stories in the Bible. But what they were great at is in this case, they obeyed, and God used them. In times of difficulty, our natural tendency is to protect ourselves. We respond in fear. We pull back. We don't know how everything's going to work out. And so we're like, it doesn't look good. I'll wait until I have more than enough wisdom. I'll wait till I have more than enough time. I'll wait till I have more than enough money. I'll wait till I have more than enough resources to do what God's telling me to do. And we get that backwards. Because God isn't waiting until we have enough. He pushes us into things when He knows we're way over our head. Why? So that we can experience a miracle. That we can see God work, and we look back and we're like, that had nothing to do with me. That was I don't know where that came from. I don't know where those words came from. I don't know where the strength came from. I don't know where the wisdom came from. That was all Jesus. And when you are in partnership with the Son of God, there is nothing like it. There's no experience. There's Disney World is schmuck compared to that. There's no vacation you could take that is better than being in partnership with the grace of God. There is no joy that you can experience that is experience. Can you imagine these disciples, they get to go home and they get to tell their family, you would not believe what happened. The crowd that stayed on the other side, they're like, yeah, we heard Jesus teach and that was good. The crowd that followed, they're like, hey, we heard Jesus teach and we're full. But the disciples, they're like, we heard Jesus teach, we saw Him love people, and we got to be a part of a miracle. We got to see lives change. We got to see Jesus do supernatural things. And this wasn't just 2,000 years ago. He wants us to be involved in that today. And so my question for all of us this morning is, where are we pulling back in fear That God would say, like, hey, he's calling us forward in faith. Where are we hiding from God where he's like, no, I know you're not gifted enough. I know you don't have enough resources. I know you don't have enough talent. I know you're bringing all your fears and your worries and doubts, and that's okay. Because it was never about you and I anyway. It's about Jesus. He fed the 5,000, but it wasn't just food. He's calling us in to supernatural, life-changing ministry. Whether that's serving a cup of coffee in Jesus' name, whether that's praying for someone as a prayer team, whether it's going across the street to your neighbor that you've been scared of forever because he thinks you're weird, and you are kind of weird, and yet you can still share the love of Jesus with him. Whether that's speaking up at work, like God is calling you and I into supernatural connected ministry with him. And it's our privilege. Like Jesus doesn't need any of us. His kingdom's coming, whether we say yes or not, but he calls us into that as partners. It's our privilege. It's his kingdom. What you see as a massive problem is God calling you. He's inviting you into a miracle. Let's pray together. Lord, we thank you this morning. You don't need us, and yet you love us. You look on us with compassion. We see problems everywhere we look. We see difficulties, obstacles, lack. And yet none of that surprises you. None of that bothers you. Because in those moments of lack, in those areas of weakness, in those areas of fear and doubt, you show up. You show up in power and strength and love, and you invite us to be a part of that incredible journey. Lord, help us to say yes to you this morning. Help us to lay down our fears, to lay down our worries, to lay down our schedules, and just say yes to you. We desire to experience that supernatural work in our lives that nothing on this world, nothing that we see can imitate. We want you to work through us and with us and in us, and we give you all the glory, we pray. In your name, amen. As the worship team comes to lead us, if you'd like prayer, the prayer team will be on the side of here. They'd love to pray over you. They'd love to pray with you. Maybe this morning it's just surrendering to what God would have.